All right. So Claire, you're going to do all the talking today because
Oh no.
I
I know,
sound
I was
terrible.
putting that together.
That's all right. That's the way I like it. I prefer it when you talk. That's the way it should be. So, reminder to everybody, we do record these. We'll post them on the YouTube later. So, if you don't want your face to appear on YouTube, you can leave your camera off. Otherwise, leave your camera on because then Claire and I can see you, and that's the way I like it. Today's behavioral science fireside chat is with my wonderful friend Claire Purvis, who I love and I've known for a long time and think is fantastic. And this will be a free flowing chat. Feel free to put questions in the chat if you like. We always will leave room for questions later, but also we always run out of time because there's so much interesting stuff to say. Claire, how are you?
I'm good. I'm doing well. It's Friday, so wrapping up a week, which is always good. But yeah,
Well,
I'm fine.
and you just came back from abroad.
Yes, I was in Paris. I'm working with, I'm sure we'll talk about it, but I'm working with a company right now that's based in Paris. They have a US entity as well. So we had a work trip, which was fun. It's a
Work trips,
good place to
behavioral
go for work.
science, behavioral science globetrotting. This is the way to go. I love it. So, Claire, I really like to take people way back, right? And you've had sort of it because, especially since you're kind of an OG behavioral scientist. Back when this was less of a like predictable path, I love to sort of get into like how did this all start for you, right? Like take me back to is it college? Is it pre-college? Like where is the fascination with humans sort of coming about for you?
Yeah. Oh boy. It was a circuitous path for me. And I will dive into it. I just want to say also, think I see someone with their hand raised. Is that
Interesting.
right? Or is that just an emoji? Okay, I'll
I
just
I
continue
ignore
on.
it. I ignore them
You,
anyway. We talk to them later.
okay. All right. Well, you heard it here, folks. Yes. So for me, mm, I still, I mean, just to set some context, I think I still I'm not sure whether to even call myself a behavioral scientist, and we can we can talk more about that since it's so many different things, and my path has gone through lots of different
Well,
chapters.
wait. So let's just start there. If I ban the words applied behavioral sciences tomorrow, you can't call yourself an applied behavioral scientist. What would you call yourself if it's not applied behavioral science?
Yeah, I know. What do you call this, right? I think it really it depends on the moment throughout the day. I'm a negotiator. I'm a diplomat. I'm a motivational speaker. I'm a clinician, a practitioner. But all of that, the beauty is in all of those things, we're looking at behavioral outcomes and we're trying to change those outcomes in one way or another. So I think actually partly through even like through our friendship, Matt, and through talking with you and seeing how you think about these things, I've come to more and more recognize that like applied behavioral science is probably the right term to encapsulate pretty much pretty much everything that I do in all of these different contexts. Um, but yeah, for me, it came through a few different ways. I think I first got so when I was in college, I never expected to end up studying psychology or going into kind of this more practical applied route. I was really interested in global human rights, global politics, and my intention was to do the Peace Corps after I graduated. Then I wanted to study human rights law and be kind of a global human rights lawyer. I was sort of on that. That was the vision. I was accepted into the Peace Corps, and then I graduated during the most recent recession, and got the letter from the U.S. government saying like, "Hey, you're still accepted, but we're not going to deploy anyone into the Peace Corps for a year and a half to 2 years." And I don't know how many people on the call are currently 22 years old or remember being 22 years old, but at that time, the thought of 2 years was like an unfathomable amount of time for me to imagine waiting to then, go do this experience. So I was like, I gotta find something else to do. What am I gonna do? And I stumbled across a job. I had graduated from college with kind of a dual focus in psychology because it was a way that I could use my AP credits and like quickly get all the credits I needed to graduate, and global studies with a focus on global politics.
So you got to my first question. I was going to say you're skipping forward too fast. We got to go back. So psychology, you were like, I have AP credits. This is the way, the fastest way to get a degree is
You needed
psychology.
the fewest credits. You just had to do a little bit of science, a little bit of humanities, do all the psychology classes. They came relatively easily to me, the topic, and I did find it interesting. I did find it, I liked all those courses, but I just didn't think, joke's on me. I think at the time I had an understanding that for psychology, you pretty much have to continue on with your studies. You have to do something beyond a bachelor's to apply that degree. And I was like, well, I'm never going to
I'm not
do
doing
that.
any of that. That sounds like work.
I was like, that sounds like a long time.
So but let's take it back to the college.
Mhm.
Did you have an inkling about, I mean, were you enjoying sort of the more clinical part, the more social? I mean, because you were also doing global studies and sort of international studies. So were you enjoying the like sort of sociological
Yeah, I
sort of,
was much more interested there. I was really interested in kind of the systems level studies, learning about kind of, you know, global political history. I had one professor in particular who really inspired me, and his background was actually as a journalist, and he had covered the genocide in Rwanda and several other kind of atrocities in the kind of 90s. And his way of thinking about, how the importance of human rights, how kind of all these different disciplines can converge to think about how we prevent future human rights abuses, how we think about justice on a global level for human rights abuses. I just found that so inspiring, and I really liked thinking about these things at a kind of at a broad macro level. Looking back, I can see how some of the things I was learning in psychology, which was a bit more of I think a more narrow focus on human behavior, emotion, and psychology, those all align. It helps us sort of think about all the reasons why people do things that they do, and things that seem so unfathomable from the outside. It's sort of, it all was meshing around in there somewhere, and they
well,
were aligned enough.
and that makes sense, right? Like a lot of social psychology comes from this sort of post World War II, people grappling with
Yes,
how could people do this. So if you're interested in, so,
yes,
you've got this professor over here who's sort of interested in how do we not cause atrocities again from a more global studies perspective, and then you've got the psychology thing sort of saying like, why do people do terrible things, right? Prince and Sam. Did you make that connection explicitly in college, or it was just sort of
no,
brewing?
no, not at all. I really didn't. I was thinking much more, as one does, right? I was very kind of, I was self-focused. What am I going to do next? How am I going to take the next steps? Everything feels so urgent. It feels so like I got to figure out the right things to do. Um, so I knew this has become a theme for my career. I knew what interested me. I knew where I felt energized, where I felt curious, and I pursued things that felt aligned with that. I didn't necessarily at the time um, put it all together, to understand why I found those things so interesting, or how I would think about the ways that these different these different topics fit together. Or I wasn't quite there.
But so then so how did you get to the Peace Corps? I mean, how did you just
Yeah.
like did you where did the Peace Corps sort of thinking come from?
Where did the Peace Corps thinking come from? I think I knew it was a thing one could do. And I knew there was, the opportunity. I think the way I understood it at the time was, you go and get immersed in this other culture, and you bring some sort of skill set or just willingness to help to bear, and you learn about, hopefully, how to support some project on a local level that's going to be helpful to people living in this local community. Uh, my application was approved to go and do kind of AIDS prevention work in sub-Saharan Africa, um, which is sort of a lottery. You don't really select the topic for the Peace Corps. You sort of get assigned to a project. But I found that super exciting and interesting. But it never came to pass, right? So the the desire was to, I think, go and, for me, always like go and learn, try to be of service in some way, and hopefully be doing work that feels very directly aligned to being helpful to other people in living better lives, being healthier, having better outcomes, right? Those have always been those mission driven sorts of themes that have continued to be really important to me in my career. I wouldn't have described it that way at the time. Probably I wouldn't necessarily have quite understood it in that way. Would have.
Hindsight bias for the win. It's fine.
It's
So
great, right?
yeah, exactly. It all looks like a linear path later.
It looks so linear.
It's fantastic, beautiful arc. So the government says, haha,
You gotta wait.
no Peace Corps for you for 2 years. You go, oh man, 2 years is I'm
Like,
forever.
what?
And so but then you end up at Stanford.
Oh no, nope, that took years.
Okay.
Then I went on Craigslist and I started looking for jobs.
As one did at the time.
As one did, particularly one who tends to be a little chaotic. I think at the time I
believe the word you're looking for is awesome. As one tends to be awesome, you went on Craigslist and started looking for jobs. Okay.
I was looking around, and then I started really doing a little more reflection, like what is actually interesting to me about different types of work. And I started looking around in the mental health field. Something felt connected there with certainly my psychology background, and personal experience with mental health, with myself and with my family. It was just it felt interesting to me. And I started searching around, being like, what can someone with a bachelor's degree even do in mental health? Like, what does that look like? And what I found, truly by luck, was a role in the state of Colorado, working for the state Health and Human Services Department in a rural community where they needed people who would. You can work with a bachelor's degree under supervision in Colorado because they need people so badly, especially in these rural areas. And my role was in what's called the Family Preservation Unit, where you work with families who have been referred due to kind of ongoing abuse or neglect or juvenile behavioral problems. And your role is really to go be with this family. You go to their home, talk to them, learn what's going on, and you advocate for resources and you connect them to counselors, and you do a little bit of light coaching around engaging with services, etc. It was all completely foreign and new to me, but it exposed me to community mental health at a very local level, and all the different practitioners kind of working in that space. So we had psychologists, psychiatrists, psychiatric nurse practitioners, people who I would now call behavioral specialists. We didn't call them that, but that's totally what they were doing, and kind of the full suite around that. And what happened, I worked there for a couple of years. It was challenging in a lot of ways, but super rewarding in a lot of ways. And I think what started to click for me was, when I work directly with these families and see what it looks like for these other professionals to be working with families and kids, man, you can really see the impact, like right away, like in 6 months, in a year, we see people's lives look totally different. And that was so energizing to me that I really started to imagine a totally different career path. When I think about global human rights, global law, that is a very, very high level. There's still definitely impact that's possible there, but it might take the course of your whole career, and you might see it in tiny ways or very, very diffuse, right? So I started to get a lot more interested in this kind of more micro level focus. But for me, I was also aware that at the community level, at this community clinic, I didn't know what to call it at the time, but I could tell we weren't doing evidence-based practice. It was very haphazard in a way. And there were lots of reasons, pragmatic, logistical, infrastructure reasons for that. But I sort of suspected that there was probably a better way. And I started to get curious about that and talk to some psychologists working at the clinic, and they kind of inspired me to think about getting a doctoral degree. If you want to understand evidence-based theories of change, how we think about, treating and supporting mental health and behavioral change in these more scalable, standardized ways, they're like, you should really learn all about it. You should go all the way, get a doctorate. And then I started applying, and that's how I ended up at Stanford.
So there's a couple of themes in there that I want to highlight because I feel like I've heard them from, in this generation of behavioral scientists. There's a couple of themes that I feel like I've heard more than once. So one was, you know, your willingness to take on maybe a sort of unusual opportunity, right? You said, "Hey, I'm going to go to rural Colorado from Wisconsin," right? Like that, that's a
Mhm.
big sort of shift, and that taking that gave you disproportionate power, right? So you talked about, hey, in other states, if you're in New York City, you can't practice psychology with a bachelor's degree. That's not a thing, right? But
Nor
because
should you
you
probably.
but because you were willing to take on this sort of odd shaped opportunity, you had this early opportunity to take on advanced responsibility, which I think
Mhm.
is a really interesting theme that you see with folks who sort of were doing behavioral science before there was like a established pathway for it, right? You see this sort of like
Yeah.
they took on some risky opportunity that gave them disproportionate responsibility. The other thing that I
Yeah.
heard the other thing I heard really clearly, and I think I've heard from others as well, is this, and then I realized there might be a better way, right? This notion that you sort of get this sense that like, hey, whatever I'm doing, however we're doing this or have been doing this, is maybe not the best way. Is sort of suboptimal, as opposed to, there is a
Mhm.
mentality where people are like, we've all been, because you said it yourself. You said, hey, in 6 months, a year, I'm seeing big changes. So there's an opportunity to say, hey, well, we must be doing it right because I'm seeing these big changes. But you're sitting here going,
Mhm.
I'm seeing these big changes, and I still think this might not be the right, this still might not be sort of scalable. So you go
Yeah.
from this,
Yeah.
world level, changing the world sort of version, right, down to the sort of
Yeah.
like, hey, hyper local version. Then you say, hey, there might be these larger structural things. And then you
Mhm.
start, you're applying to clinical programs chiefly?
Yes, this is another great irony in my career. I specifically didn't apply to any traditional research-based degrees because I thought, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do research. I want to do clinical practice. I want to do great clinical practice. I want to understand really the best frameworks, the best approaches, how they work. So I applied to very clinically oriented PhDs and to PsyD programs. And now here I am doing a bunch of research.
Wow, that's, man plans, God laughs, whatever.
I know,
Um,
I know.
so you start applying to programs. And you're
Mhm,
selecting really clinically focused programs. How do you
mhm.
how do you choose?
Oh boy, how do you choose? Especially when you know, I didn't have a ton of mentorship or guidance through the process. I was trying to kind of figure it out. So I chose the way I choose a lot of things. Obviously, there's some is, who chooses you back. So you have your down selected list of where you get accepted. Um, when I thought about the decision, you're looking at 5, maybe 7 years of your life, which, as we've established, is time was a big thing for me then, thinking about how long these commitments are. So it feels like a big decision, and it is a big decision. Um, so I took first a structured approach, where of course my apartment is covered with papers and sticky notes and pros and cons lists and financial calculations and who has scholarships and which has what professor and what specialty do they have, and it's all very very trying to be structured, trying to be quantitative. And then I step back and think about how I feel about each of the different options. Where did I have the best experience? Where did I feel the most? Again, what's led me through a lot of my choices. Where did I really feel lit up? Where did I feel excited? Where did I feel curious and, have that sort of felt sense? And for me, that was Stanford. I think for a ton of reasons about the program itself, which is not Stanford. I should, especially if this is going to be on YouTube, it is the Pacific Graduate School of Psychology / Stanford Consortium. Stanford is not the degree granting university, and that should always be clear publicly. We train in the Stanford Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. It's where we do all of our coursework, clinical, and research training. So for me, there were elements of the program itself, and then there was also this kind of when I was 14 and as a freshman in high school, I had written a letter to Stanford University saying basically like, hey, I'm a freshman in high school and your school seems great. What should I be doing to increase my chances of getting into Stanford. And then my dad later explained to me how much Stanford costs, and I was like, oh, well, I don't think I should apply to go to school there. I think I'll go to my state school. I think that seems like a good idea. But there was something also, I think the prestige, the reputation, the name, there was something that, of course, was a piece of that for me too. I wouldn't pretend that that wasn't the case. So I was just, everything was mapped out, everything was sort of quantitative, and then I just was the most excited about that opportunity. It just felt like the best fit.
That makes a ton of sense. And curiosity question: if I'd struck Stanford off the board, where would you have gone? What, was there another competitor, or was it like, no, Stanford really does feel like it's the thing, and like this is the place for me?
No, at the time there were particularly other PsyD programs that I was interested in. So Denver University was on the list. Pacific University in Portland was on the list. And they're both great programs. I think Stanford, the PGSP program manages to bring together things that some other programs, now that I understand better, just haven't been able to do. So there's, again, best laid plans. There is a depth of research exposure and training in this PsyD program that is so unique. And certainly if anyone's on the call who's thinking about getting a doctoral degree in psychology and thinking about PsyDs, like, please shoot me an email and I'm happy to talk to you about the details of why it's so special. But that amount of training was really hard to replicate elsewhere, and has turned out to be super important in my career. And the specific makeup of specialties of the professors that we could work with there, given some of my interests in body image and eating disorders, not technology at the time, I hadn't really thought about that yet, but ended up being really unique exposure there too, which is really the only reason that I'm doing what I'm doing today, is because of the people that I met at Stanford.
So +1 for Stanford, plug for Stanford there.
Yeah,
I like it.
but I didn't know at the time, right? Did not know.
So you're cruising along in your program, you're meeting these great professors. Like, where do we start going, hey, maybe I'm not going to be a clinical psychologist?
Oh, never, not until postdoc. Not until, I never thought that I am amazed that I'm doing what I'm doing. It was never the plan, but it continues to be so much fun. Yeah, I started working with a research mentor my first year of grad school, and he was one of the early researchers who was thinking about this kooky idea of how we could use the internet and computers to expand access to evidence-based mental health treatments, which truly, in 2010, people thought that was really weird. I thought that was a really fringe idea. But we were developing programs in that lab that were things like, websites that had guided educational content with a moderated chat that we as graduate students were kind of coaching and moderating in the chat. And you can see how, these sorts of ideas about how you deliver in that context, cognitive behavioral therapy over the internet, that became what we later spun out as one of the early CBT mobile apps for mental health, which was Lantern. So it all, it took time. It took us, I think, almost 10 years of academic work before that spun out as a company. But that was what we were working on in the lab, and it's kind of led directly to the sort of stuff I do now.
Let's talk about that. How did this research partnership form? How'd you find this person? Like, why this person? So talk a little bit about sort of how you found that connection, because to your point, connections, will redefine somebody's path. There's people here that are on a path. Like, how did you find that sort of that piece for you?
So this researcher, this PI at Stanford, his name is Bar Taylor. I was interested in working with him because under that technology umbrella, his focus clinically is on the prevention and treatment of eating disorders, and kind of the study of body image disturbance and improving body image disturbance. And those were clinical areas that I was focused on, in my clinical training and generally in my research interests. So I came into his lab with a desire to work on projects that were related to body image and eating, and with a complete attitude of total skepticism on all the technology stuff. I was like, this is wacky. I don't get it. I don't think there's anything here, but if we can understand, if these tools help us understand the underlying pathology, it's interesting. I want to be involved on the team, so fine, I'll do the technology stuff. I mean, fast forward a couple years later, and I'm like applying for special permission to go do my dissertation in the virtual reality lab, so I can and I was like so far in. It only took a couple years, and I was completely totally fascinated with the space.
Well, but let's drill down on that. So you go in with a skepticism. What changes your mind?
Mhm.
Like, where does technology go from something you're skeptical of to something you're enthusiastic about, and what sort of changed that?
Yeah, I think for me at that time, what I was really interested in was the ability of using some types of technology-based tools to really advance and change the way that we understand psychopathology. So when you think about the mental health fields, really in our clinical training, we were still pretty limited to learning about, these are the questions you ask people face to face in an interview to understand diagnostic likelihood and do differentials. And these are, it's really, I love clinical practice and I love face to face practice, but you have to acknowledge that we are limited in our ability to understand what's really going on for someone or understand even what these different diagnoses even mean purely on the basis of asking about clusters of symptoms and then matching those clusters of symptoms to kind of categories and lists. It is inherently kind of a limited approach. And so as a scientist, I just found it really interesting to think about, all of the unspoken nonverbal indicators of psychopathology that we might be able to detect through these different technological tools. And that was the direction that my research went with virtual reality. Um, and so it was really, I think my interest was still very, it was around our ability to understand, our ability to use tools to maybe hopefully advance our field or have just better and more effective ways of thinking about these things. I wasn't yet necessarily super jazzed on the idea of building technology-based treatments, but that was a lot of the work that we were doing, and it certainly made it was just face valid, right? There just aren't enough people to do these one-to-one treatments, and it just makes sense to think about how you get at least the basics, just get them out there in the world, right? We were building free apps at the VA that are kind of basic cognitive behavioral skills that everyone should have access to, right? There's no reason you should have to talk to me to learn about basic CBT skills. So that just made sense to me too. But I've never been one to think, that this is an either or, because I love just the richness and the depth of face-to-face work. So to me, it's never been really a competition. It's just we need more tools to do the job.
So the scaling nature of technology starts to be seductive for you, right? Especially
Mhm.
having come from Colorado, where you've seen how this doesn't scale, right? And we're hiring
Yeah.
new
In
new
Colorado, where
BAs.
I'm driving an hour from the bottom of the valley floor up into the foothills of the mountains to have a 3-hour working session with a grandmother and her 10-year-old grandson. It's like, man, that should be easier. Like, you shouldn't necessarily have to get someone who's willing to drive an hour and a half up into the mountains. Like, there's they've got internet service up there. So it was, yeah, I was like feeling the limit of scale in that work. And so it just made sort of logical sense that we should be able to use tools to get this stuff out there more easily.
So you're proceeding along. You're becoming less skeptical of technology. You're fighting to do STEM VR. I know you've also spent some time in the Netherlands, which has
I
been a,
did.
a real hub for behavioral science. I often say, you know, I've done more talks in the US than any other country, but absent the US, the Netherlands I've done a ton of talks in the Netherlands. How is Maastricht like? Tell me a little bit about sort of like, how did you choose the
Yeah.
Netherlands? Like, what happened here?
It was again, things kind of come together naturalistically, but we had a sister program, if you will, between our specifically bars team at Stanford that was really interested in eating disorders, body image, and technology. Anita Janssen at Maastricht University was the head of a lab there that was very focused on behavioral research around eating behaviors, and had one faculty member very specifically focused on body image. And that lab came and made a visit to Stanford when I was kind of towards the tail end of my dissertation. And we took them to the VR lab at Stanford and walked them through my study and, what I had designed. And it was great timing. There were grants available from both institutions to continue that body image related work. And so I was jointly funded by Stanford and Maastricht University to go and spend a year at their university, working with Caroline, the social psychologist, body image oriented member of the faculty there, on really it was sort of an open remit to come up with study designs that would allow us to continue investigating some of the hypotheses that had come out of my dissertation. So it was, good timing, right place, right time, and also I think the openness to do a little bit of a weird step. I think even though it makes such perfect sense on paper, it was still perceived a little strangely within my program at the time to say I would extend my studies by a year. There was a lot of pressure to kind of like get everything finished and go on your internship and get done. I was like, I kind of want to go off to Europe for a year and keep doing this research. This sounds really fun, and sounds like a different way of working. So I wanted to do that. There was a little bit of, are you sure? From some of my faculty mentors. But I was open to doing it. I wanted to do it. The funding was available. So it was a little bit of work to pull all the pieces together, but the timing just worked out. I am also a European citizen, so I didn't have to get a visa. So there was like a lot of things fell into place that made it possible to do that.
Got it. And so then you come back and you finish your clinical stuff, but then you don't become a clinician. So let's talk about the we don't become a clinician step, because this is really, we're wiggling a little bit in the beginning, but this is really where you start taking, you take a hard left turn and become an applied behavioral scientist rather than a clinician. Tell me about that.
Yeah. This was probably the first really big, it was a very decisive point in my career. So I came back, I finished my clinical internship at the University of Wisconsin. I got a chance to go back and did my clinical work there, which was awesome. And similarly, any clinical PhDs on the call, email me about Wisconsin. I'll force you to apply there for your internship. So I finished. I was applying broadly to, honestly, not that broadly, but to some postdocs. I was trying to figure out, the trajectory you're meant to follow is you finish your clinical internship, you do a clinical postdoc, you get licensed, off you go. So I was following the rules and applying to those things. But during my internship, that was when our team, my former team back at Stanford, had spun out Lantern as a startup out of our academic lab. They had created this, mobile CBT app company for mental health. What? Wild. Such a weird idea at the time. And so that company they had their seed funding, they closed their Series A, and then they were ready to start hiring. And so one of my mentors from Stanford, who was one of the founders of that company, I had reached out. I was like, are you growing your team? What are you doing over there? She was like, oh my gosh, are you done with your internship? This is really exciting. You should come apply for this new role we're putting together called the Clinical Innovation Lead at Lantern. What's a clinical innovation lead? This sounds interesting. So at any rate, I'm doing all these interviews at the startup.
Wait, time out. You're going to move too fast. You got to come back. What made you even be, you saw that it was spinning out. What even made you curious? Right. You're on a path. Your path is like ought to do, you're on this path.
Yep.
What happens that makes you sort of start to be interested in Lantern and be interested in what they're doing over there?
Well, I knew the work from grad school, right? So I'd been involved in that project when it was an academic project. And I'd certainly been kind of following what Megan was doing in founding the company. And I think, it's another one of these sort of following the interest or the curiosity. It was so different at the time, right? If you remember back to 2013, 2014, 2015, there were mental health startup companies, right? Particularly mental health startup companies that were founded by like the coolest person I know, Megan Jones Bell. So I was just so intrigued. And the work was really similar to the type of role I had had as a graduate student, right? I'm sort of thinking about, in the role, they want you to be thinking about what's our understanding of the evidence-based clinical approach to drive behavior change for this particular diagnostic area, right? And then how do we think about translating that into something we could digitize? So in the early days, we were really like digitizing treatment manuals, and we knew that didn't work. So we were trying to, improve that. And we'd been doing some of that in the lab. So when I understood the role, I understood, okay, I can do that. I've been doing that. And then I went and had the interview. And I think if I could paint a picture of how different these experiences were, right? I'm interviewing for a clinical postdoc at unnamed prestigious university, and I'm interviewing for this startup role. For the postdoc, I'm wearing a pantsuit, got the hair pulled back in the bun, talking through my CV, talking about, my goals for research, and just like it's very rigid, right? You need to tick certain boxes, and you kind of know the drill. I go into the startup interview, and it was like a Silicon Valley episode, right? It's a big open office space in San Francisco. I've never seen anything like that before. There's fun, colorful furniture. I'm interviewed by a woman my age who comes from like more of a creative background. We're vibing about how we would maybe collaborate on bringing some concept to life in a digital app. She's showing me how they do some of the things we've done in the lab, how they do that sort of for real with more professional tools and doing that in mobile first. And it was so exciting. And I was like, I don't even understand what we're talking about. This is so cool. So I think for me, what I've come to recognize is that other scenario for me is pretty much always going to win, right? I'm really interested in what I haven't done before. I'm really interested in stuff that feels flexible, creative, new. And it was a really hard decision because it did really at that time feel like, okay, I'm sort of saying goodbye to this traditional path. And I don't know what this startup world will offer. And we've, as time has told, we didn't make it at Lantern. We weren't successful as a company. And that's quite an experience to go through. And I would never recommend necessarily that decision to anyone else. But I think what's been important for me to recognize is, for me, that one's always going to be the right decision. I really enjoy those environments. I feel like I can bring more of a fullness of who I am to these, more kind of creatively led, slightly chaotic startup environments. I like that. And not everyone from a clinical or a research background will like that. And so it's important, I think, to also really be listening to how you feel in those different settings, right? That's been a really important tool for me to really listen to how I respond just on a felt sense level to these different possibilities or different environments, and try to choose from that place.
Yeah, and there's tons of obviously experimental background for that, right? You can make a list of all the positive features about an apartment, but just standing in the apartment is a better predictor of your satisfaction than making all the lists, right?
Yeah.
And you do
Yeah.
recognize something about yourself. I mean, you have something of the feeling about what feels right as you're going through this thing. So talk to us a little bit about the Lantern role. So you get hired, right? You meet this person.
Yeah.
It's creative. You get to work with Megan, who we both love, right? Like, go
Yeah.
off and do this thing. What's it like to come into the chaos that is Lantern?
Oh man, I learned everything. It's so much stuff goes back to Lantern as far as learning how to operate in this industry. My role was a lot of things over time, which is just the name of the game in a startup, right? Some of the key, I guess, skills that I started to build there, and certainly built a lot deeper later on at Headspace and other roles. Thinking about how a behavioral scientist, which in my role had to be both, it had to be both a clinician in the sense of understanding clinical practice and understanding clinical evidence at that long-term view, and a behavioral scientist in terms of thinking about how to create more successful user behaviors at that micro user flow level in the product. I started to learn how that perspective really starts to fit in with the traditional product triad. Like, what is our process even supposed to look like for this to work? It's so new. And we really had the benefit at Lantern of all of us just not having any idea what we were doing. And that was such a huge, huge advantage in retrospect, right? Because you had myself, our head of content, our head of product, our head of engineering. Head of engineering knew what he was doing. But the rest of us, we're getting in a room and we're saying, okay, Matt, you'll appreciate this. We're saying, okay, what are we trying to achieve here? What is this? What do we need? What's the outcome? Where are we going? All right, here's how I think about it. Here's how I think about it. Here's how I think about it. And then we're working our way all the way back until over the course of several cycles, we finally figure out, oh my God, I think we created a process here. I think we have a process for how we're going to do this going forward. And my role was about bringing that, like, so at the discovery initiation stage of say a 0 to 1 new product development process, which we did a lot. We built a lot of 0 to 1 at Lantern. New indications, kind of new ways of imagining our product. I would bring this foundational, like, okay, given we're trying to help someone, we're trying to treat someone's depression. That means they're going to be doing X, Y, and Z things. From a clinical perspective, here are the fundamental things that have to be included here. From a behavioral perspective, how I usually approached it was like, here's why that usually doesn't work in clinical practice. Like, here's the watch outs, here's the stuff we need to solve. And then we're kind of mapping out the experience over time. We think we should go like this. And then I'm working with our content team at that stage to walk them through, as a clinician, I would think about, this is the type of information someone needs, or this is the type of guidance someone needs. I'm never writing a word of copy going in the app because clinicians should never be writing copy. Copywriters should be writing copy. And we're just figuring out a process for ensuring that the eventual creative product is staying true to the clinical guidance. And all the clinical product teams are trying to figure this out as well. But we found a repeatable process whereby we could trust each other, we could work alongside one another, we could kind of mostly stay in our lanes and work quickly enough to get things out there that we could test with people. I think at Lantern, we could have done a much better job with really involving the end user in our process in a meaningful way throughout the experience. That's something I've learned to do better since then. There's lots of things we probably could have done better, but I think figuring out that process by having wonderful colleagues who all trusted each other and were willing to kind of mess it up and get it wrong and give each other feedback and figure out what worked best, like that allowed me to create at least the framework of a clinical behavior change product development process that I have brought with me to Headspace, and I made it better there, to Headspace Health, a little subsidiary there, and again made it better for another iteration. And then I just bring it with me to every company that's doing this work, and it keeps getting kind of tighter and tighter and fit for purpose for these different environments.
Yeah, I want to drill down on that because it's actually it's a feature, not a bug, right? So the feature of science is that, like, if I snap my fingers and we all forget the scientific method, it should come back that way. There's a lovely interview with Ricky Gervais about God, what is his name? Used to be on the Daily Show, now has his own show. Stephen Colbert. So Stephen Colbert is religious. Ricky Gervais is a dedicated atheist, and they're talking about religion. And one of the points that Ricky makes that Stephen goes, that's a really good point, is, if we wipe out religion, right? We snap our fingers, it's gone. We wouldn't recreate it the same way. The chances that we come up with exactly the same religions over again are highly unlikely, right? But science, right? Like physics should come back, like gravity, our understanding of gravity should come back more or less exactly the same way eventually, because gravity has this underlying truth. So it's true, this notion of like, we didn't really know what we were doing because it wasn't really a thing at the time. And yet I arrived at a process that like is relatively similar to the one that Matt, when he like did the same thing with the same set of like total unknowns, arrived at, is a feature, right? That all behavioral science processes right? We talk about process models and cognitive models. So I'm not talking combi, I'm not talking any of that. I'm talking process
Right,
models.
right.
How do we
Yeah.
build stuff? They all end up looking kind of the same because they should.
It works. Yeah, totally. No, it's when I read your book too, I think, I don't know, did I read your book before I met you or after I met you? But yeah, it's so validating, right? I think you do a much better job of explaining what you mean and explaining how the process works, but it's the same. It's the same stuff, right? Same ingredients, same general process of what we sort of pinballed our way to over many iterations at Lantern and elsewhere.
And so Lantern, doesn't make it.
Yep.
Talk to me about Headspace, right? Like, how did that
Yeah.
happen?
How everything happens. I mean, Headspace. I actually did go back to Stanford after Lantern. Once we knew we weren't going to be successful with Lantern and we started shutting the company down, I had the opportunity to join this sort of like I don't know how to describe it. It's an institute within Stanford where we focus on value-based healthcare model design. It's a program that's intended for early career clinicians. You're really supposed to basically, you get a big remit that says redesign how healthcare is delivered in the US to improve quality, reduce cost for a particular focus area. Um, I had known some people that had gone through that program. I had been learning about it. I had the opportunity to join, and I did so actually largely because when we were shutting Lantern down, um, I recognized that for myself, I just didn't really understand why the company hadn't succeeded. And I didn't understand it because I could understand how the product worked, why the product worked. Some things we could have done better and worse in the product itself. But all of the commercial context in which we operated, I had throughout my time at Lantern, even though I'd been involved in some sales enablement roles, I'd been involved in some commercial contexts. I had kind of kept my nose out of it, to be honest. I didn't really want to take on the mantle of businesswoman and business leader. I just wasn't sure about that identity, or like I had a lot of stuff about it at the time. But I recognized as we were closing down the company, that's a real detriment to my career and my ability to have impact if I continue to do this work. And what the Stanford Institute partly is about is a real trial by fire, kind of throw you in the deep end of the business of healthcare, and specifically thinking about the financial and commercial success of healthcare innovations that are intended to improve healthcare outcomes in this country. So if that's the mission, right? If we think this thing could work better and we think people could get better outcomes if we could just do this thing called healthcare better, then you better understand what makes some of those projects successful, what makes them commercially have traction, what gets your foot into this big beast of US healthcare, and what makes some of them fail. And so that's what kind of encouraged me to really dive in and do this program. Was I thought this is the fastest way I can think of to figure that stuff out, and it's so hands-on and so applied.
Yeah.
um,
I
yeah.
was very lucky in my first startup. One of the founders was really good about teaching me the business side. But if we own this sort of, every company has a business model, a behavioral model, and an operational model, right? The difference between behavioral team members and behavioral science leaders is their understanding of the models adjacent to them, right?
Yeah.
How is this actually going to get productized? How does it actually go off into operations? How does this business actually work, right? In every business I've ever
Yeah,
been in, I learned a whole hell of a lot about like, how does X industry actually make money, which is often not
absolutely.
obvious at all.
Absolutely.
So
Totally. And then that was the real reason for Headspace as well. I mean, there's the personal reason, which is Megan Jones Bell had since moved on from Lantern to Headspace. She was building out her team there, and truly, I've said this in so many forums, but I would follow Megan into a burning building. I mean, she is. I think that's a big theme for me in my career, is the leader that I can work with is such a huge reason to take a job or not take a job. Um, and Megan is a phenomenal leader, someone that I absolutely adore working for and learning from. So she had the opportunity to grow her team. And what she wanted to do specifically was bring on a behavioral science leader to create the function of behavioral science in Headspace writ large, with a focus to start on the consumer mindfulness app business, to really help that product team start to shift the way it thought about building product to be a product that can drive behavioral change. They just didn't have the mindset or the process in place to do that at the time. And so her goal was, let's bring on this leader, let's build out a team, and let's bring behavioral science into the Headspace product. So that was the original reason why I joined. But the meta reason was, at the time, there were no consumer health and wellness companies as successful as Headspace. It was amazing how they had scaled this brand, how they had, made meditation a thing. And so I was so curious to learn, how do you do that? Like, what does that look like? And it was a bit of a decision point. I was also very drawn to go deeper into healthcare, to go deeper into value-based care. But I decided to go into consumer wellness, really to work with Megan, and was also really interested in learning about that sort of very foreign to me part of this industry, thinking about direct-to-consumer subscription business, health and wellness. How do you do that, right? It was really different at the time.
Yeah, I love that. And you started there as a director, and then pretty quickly it started sort of escalating in importance.
It escalated quickly.
Escalated, like so much of our career, it escalated quickly.
Yeah, well, the role just required a more expansive remit. That became clear very soon after I joined. So I joined, as many people on the call I think will have experienced. When I joined, I was the only behavioral scientist. And the very first job is, without saying so, like, prove to us that we need behavioral science, right? Prove the model. So I had to do that on my own at first. Or you never do it on your own. I had to do it by winning hearts and minds at first, and then picking a project where there was a high likelihood of success and leading it through to completion. But we were able to build out the behavioral science team. That went well, and we were able to build out a behavioral science team focused on the consumer product. But a lot of things were moving in parallel to that. The company was interested, in a sense, in exploring the possibility of pivoting to a more explicit kind of healthcare business. And so we were building a digital subsidiary business with a more explicit kind of health product. And I was, the role needed to expand so that I could oversee product development from a clinical and scientific perspective on that team. And we were also, at the same time, we were getting a ton of organic growth on the enterprise business, but it needed more kind of guidance and leadership again on how should the product serve the needs of our enterprise customers. And so my role expanded to cover that as well. And then into healthcare commercialization with payers and providers. We needed a clinical and scientific kind of voice in those sales conversations. So the role it needed to do more. The company needed, for better or worse, the company wanted to do a lot of things at the same time. And so the role expanded really quickly, and we were able to build out a few teams under me to keep each of those areas sort of running at scale.
Pablo, that's a great question. They Headspace had a product team. How did you interface with them? How did you start to make connections with them? How did you sort of help them start to see the value of this?
I did it through two main approaches that I use everywhere. One is evangelizing. So I actually think that's a good explicit kind of goal to have when you're in these roles where you're the first and you're the only. One tool you have is really your ability to win hearts and minds. So I evangelized. I gave talks. I joined teams. I really leaned on some of my my motivational speaking skill set, right? Of, this is a skill that's good to develop. So I got people excited about what might be possible if we started to think about our work explicitly as behaviorally oriented, right? Bringing in language of behavioral science, bringing in Matt's language is the most widely applicable I've found, talking about pressures, talking about behavioral statements, talking about outcomes. It's very approachable. It's very easy language. I really didn't come in hot with any theoretical frameworks. I had them in my head, but I didn't come into product teams saying COM-B, motivation, acceptance and commitment therapy. I didn't say any of that stuff. We kept it really simple and made it feel exciting, approachable, effective. right? We ran a project early on. Matt came in a couple times working on this project with us, but we ran a really successful project where we brought together quant, qual, design, research, and we tried to figure out how we could improve engagement in the first 30 days of your experience of Headspace. Through that project, we used a ton of behavioral language. We used behavioral design frameworks. We brought people along to it, but we also proved you can do this quickly. And we lifted first week engagement by 10% with one of our experiments in that project. And so I think that started to show if we do this, if we're willing to work in a different way, we could really achieve a lot of outcome quickly. But what I'll say is, that doesn't immediately scale. It didn't get picked up across the whole team. There were allies, there were detractors. There were pockets in the organization where we could run that sort of process and get those sort of outcomes, and we could be successful. And I always encourage my team, like, focus where you can do that and recognize that there are parts of the organization that are less amenable to changing the way they work. And right now that's the case. Over time, maybe we'll win them over as well, right? But we kind of have to focus on being effective where we can. But I think approachable frameworks, fitting yourself into the existing process is required, right? It's not helpful to come in and say, let's do everything differently from start to finish. Follow me, it'll be great. You kind of have to fit yourself in, use approachable language, approachable frameworks, and you can, I've found, kind of sneakily change more and more and more about the process every time you run it. And that's kind of how it played out at Headspace. Was now they run a sort of a completely different process than they used to 5 years ago, but we certainly didn't start there. We started by sneaking in a little bit of pressure mapping into an existing design project, right? And then you just sort of like, ooh, didn't that work well? Wasn't that exciting? What if we also did this? You just, chip away at it. That's my approach usually.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think that, to your point, behavioral science, while it is this, we talk about SIDE, strategy, insights, design, evaluation, this full process. Even if you get people to do one part of it better, still better than it was, right? Like, it's not, yes, we want them to do the full thing, but even one advancement is good. We're going to have you back again. Like, this hour went by way too quickly. Tell me a little bit about, I want to make sure that we talk about, you're running some training and education stuff for women in health. And I want to make sure we talk a little bit about that. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're up to?
Yeah, I'll give you the quick spiel. So I lead an organization called Well. Our purpose is to support women with clinical and scientific backgrounds who are either already working in the tech industry or are interested in making that transition, specifically digital health. So we do a lot of things. It's a free community to join. A lot of it is really organic and kind of self-determined. But we a couple of years ago, last year, I started offering our first kind of more structured paid professional development program. This is a career accelerator for women with clinical and scientific backgrounds who are already in seat as leaders in digital health companies. And this is really about trying to radically accelerate their business leadership skills and acumen. Really kind of, I created the program based on, that experience I spoke to at Lantern of saying, it took me quite a while to figure out how to think about business in an effective way and how to apply my skills specifically as a business leader. And it doesn't have to take that long. So I've kind of distilled that down into an 8-week curriculum. It's a cohort-based learning program. We've run 2 cohorts so far. We'll probably do one more in the fall. It's super fun. It's the most fun thing that I do right now. And Well, as a community is, again, it's free to all women of those backgrounds. And there's lots of ways to get involved short of the specific professional development program.
It looks like some of your members are are praising you as we go.
Yay!
So
thanks,
we're out of time. We're out of time.
We are.
And Claire is very busy, but we're going to get her back again because she's so fantastic. And I love talking to her so much. And we're going to do it when my voice doesn't sound like this. Claire, thank you so much
for doing this, Matt.
Time. We're going to talk more soon.
Let's do
so
it.
Nice to have you.
So great to be here. Feel better, Matt. Rest up your voice. No more talking today.
All right. See everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thanks so much. See ya.